First and foremost, just to cover our agenda for today, we're going to be going over an overview of Experience Cloud from a technology standpoint and talk about the different use cases that exist, some different scenarios that you can implement with Experience Cloud in your organization, and why you would want to test it, why testing Experience Cloud is important. Should go without saying, but we will talk through that, of course. And then we'll talk through how Provar tests Experience Cloud specifically. What are some capabilities and specific things that Provar has natively built into the platform to allow you to test Experience Cloud end to end. And then, of course, we'll showcase all this with a demo. Lastly, we'll have our Q&A. Okay, so kicking things off. This is more of a technology overview, but Experience Cloud, for those of you that don't know, it's hosted on the Salesforce platform, but it uses a combination of a lot of different web technologies to make everything run under the covers. So you have the Lightning Web runtime, you have LWCs, otherwise known as Lightning Web Components, you have modern HTML5 and CSS3 and JavaScript, and of course you have the SLDS or the Salesforce Lightning Design System, which is soon to be SLDS 2. So these are kind of the four main pillars, if you will, that make up Experience Cloud. And what this all gives you is the capability to create your own customer-facing or internal. We'll go through all the different use cases, but basically it gives you the capability to create your own website. A lot of different technologies, a lot of building blocks to allow you to do this. I'll kind of talk about each of these a little bit more. So the LWR is what allows for the kind of the build your own experience. It can support statically generated content through the CDN, which is a content delivery network. So it allows you to fetch data via APIs and use those in the content. It's used primarily for high performance websites, sites with a lot of traffic and things of that nature. LWCs, many of you will be familiar with, are very common in the SFDC platform today, salesforce.com. So it's a really big part of just modern Salesforce, even in Sales and Service Cloud, but they're also going to be prevalent inside of Experience Cloud as well. They align with modern web standards and basically provide you with a framework for building custom HTML and modern JavaScript. Then we have HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript, which are all just core web technologies, basically the foundational web technologies that make Experience Cloud sites work. This would allows it to be fully compatible across all browsers and devices, so for mobile experience and things like that. And then we have the Salesforce Lightning Design System, which is really just a set of development guidelines and frameworks and styling. So that's why when you look at Experience Cloud, you may notice some similarities in terms of the look and feel to a Salesforce application whenever you're going into it. Now I'll talk through some use cases for Experience Cloud. So companies use Experience Cloud for a number of different things. You may find customer support portals being one of the more common ones. So customers can basically go on there, submit cases, track their status, access FAQs, any kind of knowledge articles that you may have published to them through that site. Some couple of different highlights that I guess that you could focus on from a testing perspective if you're implementing a customer support portal would basically just be the usual suspects. You want to make sure that you can verify that all customers can log in and access their personalized dashboards. So making sure that personalization is there, that persona-based testing is being implemented, that you're testing as the actual user that's going to be using that application. You also want to be able to validate the case creation workflows. So making sure that all the mandatory fields are being provided on the Experience Cloud side of things. Any kind of dynamic pick lists are coming in with the appropriate values and all of that. That's kind of a bi-directional verification, an end-to-end workflow. And I'll actually show as part of my demo a case creation workflow so we can see that in action. Now, moving on, the partner portal is another use case that we see quite often for Experience Cloud. So you may have a consumer goods company who uses Experience Cloud to provide partners with access to catalogs for all their products, promo materials, and different reports and things of that nature. So you want to be able to validate the partner registration process, including any approval workflows, any role assignments that you have for those partners, making sure that they can download and access the appropriate materials, test all the different product catalogs that you have available. So CPQ is very prevalent in this implementation. So you want to ensure that the integration between Experience Cloud and Salesforce CPQ works seamlessly. So you have all those configurations that you're testing. Now, another one is community portals. So this would be more prevalent. Usually in the healthcare industry, you'll see healthcare providers maybe using Experience Cloud for a patient portal. This is what they'll use to manage appointments, view any kind of results, communicate with their providers, and things of that nature. It also allows them to test different compliance regulations, such as HIPAA, and making sure that the appropriate data is being locked down in those different environments. And lastly, but not least, we may use this for an employee intranet. So you may have a technology company or someone who wants to basically manage all of their employee information in one single location. So rather than using outdated sites like SharePoint and things like that, you can use an Experience Cloud site as an employee intranet to basically access all your HR resources and things of that nature. So from a testing perspective, of course, you would want to test that internally with your users. It may not be as high of risk because you're not dealing with external customers in this case, but you still want to make sure that you're having different roles set and you're validating those roles so that all of your users within your organization don't have access to the wrong things or potentially information that they shouldn't have. And of course, there's many other use cases here you'll find all over the web for Experience Cloud. These are just a couple that we're mentioning here, some of the highlights. But yeah, there's a lot that you can do with it. So why do we want to test it? Now, there's a couple of different topics that we'll cover here. And any of you that have seen a presentation from myself before, you'll know I like to use imagery to kind of illustrate points here. So I have a meme here that kind of celebrates this a little bit. But Experience Cloud's been around for a while now. Many companies are still adopting it, however, and they're going in with a lot of excitement and a lot of anticipation. But without proper testing, you could be left with some pretty embarrassing bugs in production, maybe assuming that everything's just going to work out of the box or everything's just going to be an easy process and there's not going to be any kind of like back and forth development. But because they're customer facing a lot of the time, there is a heavy need for persona-based testing, as I've mentioned, and user experience testing is of critical importance in these applications. So ensuring functionality is the number one reason why we want to test it. I put duh here because that's kind of what testing is for, right? We want to make sure the thing works. So this goes without saying. I'm not going to go into that anymore, really. The second one is user experience validation. This is a little bit more of a gray area for some folks. They don't necessarily know what they're trying to validate when they're talking about user experience. So you want to make sure that there's user-friendly interfaces, that menus, links, and content layouts are not causing frustration for your end users. You also want to make sure that they render properly across different devices and mobile, of course, and of course, all the different browsers are supported properly there. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about user experience validation. Performance optimization may be something that larger companies would be interested in, making sure that their sites are highly performant and they can handle heavy loads, high user traffic. So there's going to be a lot of bottlenecks sometimes when you're using an external facing site because a lot of users may have access to it at different high peak times. So you want to make sure that you're testing those times under stress and you're doing proper load and performance testing ahead of time so that you know how it behaves and you can anticipate any kind of API response times that are going to cause delays for pages to load and things like that. Then we have compliance. I mentioned this for healthcare, but there's a lot of industries that have compliance and regulations and things that they need to handle from a security perspective in terms of what data they surface to their users through Experience Cloud. So you want to make sure that all the sensitive data is, of course, in compliance with all of your standards. You follow Salesforce best practices and industry standards. They have a lot of these built into custom objects and fields already. So when you're surfacing those in Experience Cloud, a lot of times you don't necessarily have to do anything custom there, but if you do have a custom implementation, you may need to test that properly to make sure it's working for different users. And the last one here that I'll kind of mention, well, second to last one anyway, is business continuity, which may sound a little grandiose when I say that. You know, you don't want to make sure your business can continue. But really, this at the end of the day, if your experience site is an external facing, a customer facing website, and they're using it as part of your product or as part of your offering, onboarding process or checkout process or anything like that, then it is very, very important that, of course, they're able to perform the login process, whatever processes they need to perform to basically use your product. So anything that's broken or poorly functioning from the Experience Cloud site can harm not only your revenue, but also the organization's reputation, which can have large ramifications down the road. So testing for business continuity, really all this means is you're making sure that there's uninterrupted access to your Experience Cloud site. There's high availability, high uptime, and that the core functionality is being tested at the utmost priority. Now, in terms of production issues, of course, we want to avoid those. Kind of goes without saying. So that's the whole reason why we want to test this in lower level environments. You really need to test your integrations with Experience Cloud and other systems in lower level environments and not just assume that it's going to work the same when you get into production. So integration testing is something that's very common in Salesforce and ecosystem because you have sandboxes and developer orgs and scratch orgs and things like that. A lot of times this is standard practice, but testing with integrations can be tricky because you need to have access to all the data, all the right systems to be able to test the full end-to-end process. So Experience Cloud is no different. You want to make sure that you have an implementation that has a lower level environment so you can test it properly before it hits production. So now I'm going to get into how Provar tests Experience Cloud. This will mainly be covering a couple of different key points that Provar handles very well, but also allows you to do out of the box with Experience Cloud support. So the first one is kind of the whole thing, right? So end-to-end automation. When we say end-to-end flow automation, really what we mean is that Provar is able to automate and validate your flow from an Experience Cloud site to another system or to Salesforce or anywhere else, basically a beginning to end process for an end user, right? We want to be able to automate that and test it so that way the first time it's happening, it's not happening in production, right? You've already ran through that full scenario, not one piece here, one piece there, and testing all the inputs and outputs, but you want to test the entire thing together. And the reason why that's important is, again, because things behave differently when they're run in sequence sometimes. And the way that Provar handles this, of course, is through a number of different ways, but we have, of course, UI testing, where you can test the front-end application through API calls, any kind of REST or SOAP-based APIs that you're accessing through Experience Cloud. We can validate that data using API calls. We can also, using our inbuilt Salesforce SOQL support, so we can perform SOQL queries to interface with any Salesforce objects that you may be creating, modifying through Experience Cloud. So you can do the back-end validations without having to go into Salesforce and verify it manually there. And then, of course, there's support for multiple different types of database testing. If you have databases that are interfacing with Experience Cloud and you want to basically just verify that from the back end, we can do that there as well. The only other things that I'll really mention for this piece are a little bit more niche use cases, but you may want to do email validations for your Experience Cloud implementation if you have kind of a case management system where they have an email to case, or they raise a case and they need to get an email response immediately from, one of your workflow processes, or, some kind of trigger or something like that. You want to make sure that you're validating that as part of your testing, and that's not just like a missing piece. So you definitely want to make sure that that's part of your automation and not, supplemented with manual effort, because that can be very tedious, right? And then anything else that's out of the box here, Pro Code users can utilize our custom test steps within Provar for any unsupported scenarios. So you can implement your own test steps in the Provar interface that allows you to test basically anything that you would like to test from that perspective. Okay, so moving on. So authentication is a big part of this, and that's kind of the getting started piece for Experience Cloud in reality. You want to be able to authenticate to your Experience Cloud site, but as I mentioned before, you want to be able to log in as your actual community user. So we have a community-specific login within Provar Automation that allows you to log in as any community-enabled user. So you can test as that user. We also have multi-factor authentication and single sign-on enabled for these sites. So if you have that kind of login process, we support that authentication as well. Now, I talked a little bit about this one, but when I say operational levels of Provar, this is more of a high-level topic, but Provar supports kind of all different user sets. So the no-code users who just want to go in and do more web-based automation, more drag and drop, we support that through point and click of our test builder and metadata-based support for Experience Cloud and Salesforce. Then you're kind of moving up the chain to low-code users who may want to utilize our proprietary framework for testing Experience Cloud sites and external websites through our own way of handling that. That's outside of metadata, which requires minimal coding in that case. But then we have the pro code option, which I kind of mentioned too. So you can create your own custom test steps completely out of the box through code inside of Provar to complete any tasks that are not natively supported by the platform. So we give you the full flexibility to basically support you at any stage there, whether you're a no-code user, low-code, or pro-code. And the last piece here, which is primarily what I'll be demoing, and this is really kind of supplemental to end-to-end, but when we say front-end testing, Experience Cloud, as I covered in the overview, is highly complex, right? You have a lot of different technologies at play here, and Provar has two core frameworks that we use for mapping and supporting Experience Cloud and all of its different components. So these two core frameworks support over 90% of Experience Cloud elements natively out of the box with no customization or anything like that. The reason we say 90% because there's always going to be some custom implementation that may require a different kind of use case and that kind of thing. But for the most part, you'll see it works out of the box. You won't need to edit anything. But the pro code users, as I mentioned, they do have the capability to build out any kind of custom page object operations or test steps to handle more bespoke implementations, we'll say, of Experience Cloud that are not natively supported. Okay. So that covers most of kind of how Provar tests Experience Cloud. Now I want to get into a brief demonstration. I say brief. Let me jump over to Provar real quick. So I'm going to go through two primary scenarios here. Now, the first scenario that I'm going to be kind of walking through is a banking console case workflow. So this is basically going to be the process of a community user logging in, scheduling an appointment with a banking representative, and then kind of going from the Salesforce side as that banking representative logging in as that user, and then performing some actions there. So let me go ahead and open up our test builder here, and we can see this in action. So as I mentioned, first and foremost, we have our initial connection, which is going to be logging in as that banker. So we're just going to log into our console application. Okay, so we're logged in here as Justin Chen, who is our relationship banker. That's his persona in this particular demonstration. Now we're going to be logging into the community where we'll be scheduling that appointment. So in case you're wondering, if you've never seen Provar before, what's happening here? These connections that are happening, these are configured connections. So basically within the Provar interface, you can create connections to Salesforce, of course, using, username, password, OAuth, MFA, etc. But once you have that admin connection created, you can actually use that to log in as all these different personas without having to create additional credentials or anything like that. You just need to know their username and what application you want to navigate to, and Provar takes care of the rest. So this one logs me in straight into the community here, and now it's going to go through and basically create that appointment. So it'll happen pretty quickly here, but it's basically going through this process of configuring all the appointment details, selecting the appointment type. Now it's going to go to the next page here where it's going to perform a search for a particular territory. So we'll see it selected there. We're going to select the first branch here, and it's going to continue on, and we're going to assign this to Justin Chen, set our appointment time, and it's already been set. So now we have a kind of a step here that's waiting for that appointment to confirm. So now it's been confirmed. So as soon as that appointment is confirmed, it's going to be, of course, sent over to the banker. So the scheduled appointment is completed. So now we can switch back over and continue our process from here. And I'm going to pause as soon as this step happens here because I do want to cover how we're getting to this record immediately. So something that Provar helps you with natively, and this is not Experience Cloud specific or anything like that, is that we have this capability to capture information from the screen, but also from the backend. So we can perform a SQL query. If I go here, this SQL query that we're performing as part of our test case using a drag and drop step from Provar, we basically just want to select our appointment that we just created. And we do see that it returns a row here. So the query was successful. It gives me a row back. And if I look at my return value here, I can see it pulls in my account ID, the scheduled start time in a date time format. We get our start time and our start date and all of that. So we're pulling in all that information from a SQL query. And the reason we're doing that is because we're operating as two different personas here. So as we create the appointment in the community, we perform the SQL query as the banker to basically just say, okay, what record do I need to navigate to from that side of things? So it's more of a testing specific thing, but in this case, this allows us to navigate directly to that record in the UI. So this is the scheduled appointment that we just created. We captured it from SQL, and then we're able to navigate to it automatically. So that's something that Provar handles out of the box. Okay, so now we're going to go in and basically do some assertions. We're going to validate the territory is correct as we set in the appointment. Then we're going to go in and change the owner to the correct banker in this case, because I believe we just set it to any available banker whenever we were scheduling it from the end user's perspective. And we can even add additional steps here. So just to kind of show you how Provar Test Builder works, I paused it really quickly. Basically, the way that our point-click test builder works is anything you want to interact with in the interface of your website, you just right-click on that element and click Add to Test Case. And what you'll see happen is that Provar will capture the element details over here in Test Builder, and basically it's staging a test step for you. So you need to tell Provar, okay, what do you want to do with this element? Do you want to check a checkbox? Do you want to set a field? Do you want to do an assertion, a validation, anything like that? So we can add steps like that to our test case, even though this test is already built. So it's very interactive in that sense. And you can also right-click on any step in your Test Builder window and jump to different points in execution. So this makes debugging very easily to do and perform inside of Provar. Even if you're doing this kind of testing where you're going between two different personas, we can map steps as two different users and two different browsers at the same time, the same test case with no problem. Okay, so we verified that appointment. We've assigned it to the correct user. Now we're going to go through and activate this inline edit field where we're going to be basically just modifying a couple of values, checking the agenda, setting the description accordingly, and then saving the record. Okay, now we're going and we're just going to reschedule this appointment. So it came in at 12, so we're actually going to reschedule it for a different time here. So it's going to schedule it for 1:30 p.m. and we'll get a confirmation message here in just a moment. So once that appears, we'll have a validation to confirm that the service appointment is set, and we'll click finish. Okay, so now the reschedule has happened. This is kind of the back and forth and the end to end. It's very difficult to do this manually, right? Because you're logging in to different browsers, you're kind of going back and forth. Once you have automation for this, it makes it very easy. So now I can, I'll switch back to the other browser so you can see what's happening. And I've labeled my test steps, so you'll see this is happening in the community now. So now what's going to happen is it's going to go back to the community site. It's going to go to our appointments page and do a quick refresh here. And then it's going to click on that appointment. And then it's going to cancel that appointment. And the reason is after the reschedule, this particular user is not available during that time. So we're going to say unavailable at the scheduled time, click cancel here, and then confirm the cancellation. Once the cancellation is confirmed, we go back over into the banker side of things, and we just confirm it on that end as well. So we're doing this bi-directional validation. So we're confirming that the status here is canceled, and that the cancellation reason is appropriate. Now, one thing to note here on this test that we're running through, all the data that I'm using, all the text, all the dates, all the values, for some of these, they're statically set. For some of it, it's actually being pulled in from a spreadsheet from a data source. So we can make the entire test flow, the entire end-to-end process data-driven. So this allows us to cover a multitude of different scenarios very easily inside of Provar just by updating our spreadsheet and adding additional rows. And we can run through the test case in a loop and run through each row of data, basically allowing us to scale our testing very easily. And the more API, the more sockets that we use in our tests allows us to scale it even faster. So in this case, a lot of it's UI, but it still executes pretty quickly. But you can see that scenario there. So that was one example of an end-to-end example of Experience Cloud and Salesforce kind of working together. I'll show another one here. Let me jump over back into Provar. So our second example is going to be an insurance console case workflow. So this one's going to be slightly different. We're going to be raising a case and taking that case on as the insurance representative, the service agent in this case. So I'll go ahead and launch Test Builder, and we can see this one in action. Again, here we have two users that we're emulating. These are two different users, but this is all actually happening in the same org as before. It's just going to be a different community, a different user, and a different console application. Okay, so we've logged in as Tim Smith. And now we're going to go ahead and resume here and just log in as our other user. And I'll set a pause here just so it doesn't run through the entire section. Okay, so you see here we have a very different community site. Now there's a lot of different things that we can do on this particular community site. It's an insurance policyholder page. So basically we can use this to raise cases. We can also use this to file claims and things like that. There's a lot of different workflows that we could automate in this particular example. But this one, we're just raising a new case. So here we have it here. So we're just going to go ahead and resume and set those fields and click Save. And it may take a minute here. So you'll notice a lot of these steps, they're kind of waiting for the page to load, or they're waiting for the previous step to execute or complete before they're getting done. So we have a lot of dynamic waits inside of Provar that allow us to operate our test cases under a lot of different conditions. Because when you're automating a test, you could run it on your machine and it runs in a minute. And then you could run it on someone else's machine and it runs and it takes 5 minutes. So you need your test to be able to account for different performance and different load times. So Provar has that natively built into the platform. So a lot of our steps have these auto waits that are automatically kind of waiting for the page to load. And you can set different values for that. So that's what's happening there. Now, in this example, we also extracted the case number. So once the case has been created, of course, we get a case number. So we're extracting that case number because later on, we're going to use that to access the case from the back end and take care of our data cleanup. But now let's go ahead and continue on to back into our application here. So now we're going to log into our omnichannel. And once we're logged in, we should get a case coming in and we should be able to accept that case. Well, now my omnichannel is not wanting to perform. So this is the reason why we test things. Okay, so in this instance, what should be happening in this case, the case should come in through the omnichannel and we should accept that case. We see here the test failed because it's trying to accept a case that isn't there. So may not be able to complete this entire scenario in this example because the rest of it is basically doing some validations and performing a password reset for the user and closing out the case here. I'm not sure why the case isn't coming in this case. I could try to do a refresh and see if that resolves it. I actually don't see the case created here, interestingly enough. Okay, so 2697. Sorry. Give me 1 second here, just as a sanity check. Okay, there's the case. Just going to do a manual workaround here so we can finish the rest of this. Okay, so now we are officially the case owner. So we'll pretend that we've accepted that case. So normally it would take you to the case record page whenever you accept it from the omnichannel. For whatever reason, it's not coming in through there. It could be because the case origin is not the correct value in this case. So it could have been something that was changed on the back end. Anyhow, we'll go ahead and step through here. So let me jump to the next section of the test. And we will play this through. Okay, so we're just moving it to the next status here. So response has been received. So we're setting that as a status. And we're going to send login credentials, basically using this little button here to send this to our contact, Rachel Adams. So it's setting the status pick list here to waiting on customer and clicking save. So the status of this case will change, and we'll be able to validate that on the end user side as well. And we'll just go ahead and mark this milestone over here completed. So the solution has been proposed. So it's going to check that milestone over there on the left-hand side. Okay, so now we're going back over to the community side of things, where we're going to be closing out this case. So I'll just go ahead and resume and setting the status to close. Everything's been done. User's happy. They close it from their end, which may or may not be the workflow for you, but in this case it is. So the case has been closed, so we can go back over to our service console and we can resume and mark our case milestone again here as completed for our case closed. And there's this nice little alert, which I also showed that Provar can handle those. So we have a little handle UI alerts feature that allows you to dismiss those if it's just something that pops up. So that's a Salesforce issue. Okay, so that's a full scenario. So we did have one little hiccup there with the omnichannel. It's probably because of the case origin not being the correct value. So that may be something on that end. However, we got around that. So, you know, this is the reason why we test things, of course. So now the last bit here is our test data cleanup. So as I mentioned, we extracted that case number earlier on. So we're going to use that case number to perform a quick SOQL query to retrieve the ID and then delete it. So that way we don't have any records outstanding. So being able to do this data cleanup is very good for testing, especially if you're doing a lot of automation. You want to make sure that you're cleaning up your org regularly. So if your automation takes care of it for you, we have these nice little finally steps inside of Provar. So the reason why these are good is that even if the test fails, if this record's been created, it'll still execute this step to delete it. So even if the case has been created but something else fails, it'll still go in and perform that cleanup for you. So in this case, I think I may have the wrong number, or maybe I didn't return an actual value. So probably has something else to do with my omnichannel. But in this case, so what should be happening is performing that SOQL query, retrieving it from that case number, and then deleting that case from the back end. So in this case, it failed, presumably for something other reason that I had from before. But that's another end-to-end scenario there that you can perform with Experience Cloud. And honestly, the Experience Cloud site worked fine. The Salesforce stuff is where I kind of ran into some issues, but again, probably because of my omni-channel or something like that. So I want to really quickly, I'll of course recap our two scenarios, but I do want to show kind of how some of this was set up, just to show you how easy it is to create these connections inside of Provar. So in our settings, we have lots of different connections that you can create, but in our Salesforce connections, this is where we can create our normal connections, our community connections, and things like that. So if you're connecting to a new community, such as our insurance holder, this is what the connection details look like. So basically, we select login as, and we use our admin connection here. And then we set the username that we will want to log in as. And then we just need to provide either the ID of the community or the name as it appears in Salesforce. So this connection now allows us to log in as that community user and navigate directly to that Experience Cloud site. So this is built into Provar. So we have that support out of the box for Experience Cloud and being able to log in as those community users. So that's how I set up those connections. Now we have these other connections that we're using, such as our service agent, which is similar. We're still using the login as to log in as our admin, but then we're performing just the username here, or giving the username here in this case to log in as a particular user, and there's nothing else that we need to specify. So we don't need to know the password or anything like that. So this allows us to log in as different personas very easily inside of Provar. And then once those those connections are created, we can drag and drop them into our test cases. So for example, we have the service agent. You can drag it into your test case here, and it'll add it just like that. And that's how it performs a connection. So this connection will open up my browser, log me in as that user, and then navigate to whatever Salesforce application I specify inside of the UI. Okay, so the first scenario, again, I went through a banking community, which was an Experience Cloud site that was deployed, and we saw how we could schedule an appointment with our banking representative, totally custom screen flow there inside of Experience Cloud, natively supported by Provar. And then we saw the Financial Services Cloud side of things, where we were going as the banker and modifying that appointment and performing some actions. And then we had the insurance community example where we were raising the case, which should have been routed to the omni-channel had I had the correct origin, and then taking care of the rest of the steps that I had there. So you can kind of see how this would work for any example if you kind of follow these test cases as templates. So that's all I had for my presentation for today and the demo recap. I do want to get into our questions now. So I'll go ahead and take a look and see what we've got coming in through our chat and our Q&A and see what questions we have. Okay, so I'm going to look at the Q&A first. I do see there's a number of questions in the chat as well. If I don't get to your question, go ahead and ask it again in the Q&A because I may miss it in there, but I'll try to cover them all. Okay, so the first one here, can I test the customer experience on a mobile device not simulated or emulated, either physically connected to the computer or in a device farm? It's a great question. So currently what you can do in Provar is, of course, you can create a test, an automated test that tests the web experience. So basically mobile rendering, mobile browser, that kind of thing. We can test that, of course. We can test any different resolution, any browser, anything like that. So that's what we can currently support. We don't currently support mobile testing out of the box for native apps. But you can execute your test cases using like an AWS device farm or something like that if you want to test different resolutions and different browsers. Hopefully that answers your question there. Next question, can I add more data to the XML test results for a test run? Example, given time a step takes to complete for performance testing. Yes, so the timestamps are actually captured in Provar by default. So if I go to my execution here, I can turn that on and say show start end times, show durations. And you could see here on the right-hand side, it shows how long it took to execute each different section. And once you go to export this test run to a report, or if you run it through CI/CD, those timestamps will actually just be built into that. So you can have those available. Another question around performance testing. Oh, great. Can you use Provar for performance testing? In your example, if multiple users are trying to book an appointment or create a case from Experience Cloud, how would you monitor the response time? Can you use it for stress testing? Great question. So what I've just illustrated was one example where you may be able to do some validations on the timings there within Provar and see those in the report. You can also add what we call SLAs and tags to your test cases, which will show up in the report. So say you think a particular scenario should take 2 minutes and that's your SLA, or 30 minutes or whatever it is. You can actually add that to a test case, and if it's over that time, it'll show up in the report, and you can generate a specific report for those kinds of timings. So that's what you can do. In terms of stress testing, Provar typically operates sequentially. So you create a test case, and as you saw me executing in a test builder mode, it's running sequentially. So that's kind of the overhead version, right? But we do have a CLI component as well, where you can execute Provar from the command line, and allows you to run it behind the scenes, and so you can run as many parallel threads as you want once you're doing that. A question here may need a clarification, but let me see if I can take it. So it says, does Provar support metadata, NitroX, and page objects for experience sites? The answer is yes. I don't know what if you're looking for more there. I guess I'll elaborate a little bit. There's going to be a variation, right, of what is supported based on what you're testing and how custom it is. So in my example that I illustrated, it was a combination of all three. So I had some NitroX, and for those of you that don't know what NitroX is, it's Provar's basically our proprietary framework for handling Lightning Web Components and Screen Flows and things like that, which are present in Salesforce and Experience Cloud. So we have that out of the box. And then we also have the standard page object model for anything else. So anything else that we need to test that's not through the Salesforce metadata or through NitroX, that's kind of our fallback. So kind of a 3-tiered approach there. Someone asked which Provar product is being demoed. Yeah, great question. So if you didn't catch our previous webinar on testing Agentforce, that was the first time I showed the new interface, but this is the second time. And in fact, I'll be showing it and highlighting it specifically. We have a webinar coming up at the end of February that goes over the Provar interface that I'm demoing now, which is not currently available, but is coming soon. So it is the same product, but we've changed it. Okay, so we have a question here. How can Provar validate all the permissions sets? Like when Provar has access to multiple objects and each object has read, edit, modify, etc. permissions. How do you validate all the permissions? And where do you store the expected data? So this is a great question. Normally, if you're doing this manually, it is extremely intensive, labor intensive, because what you would need to do is go into the object manager, go into the layout and see which fields the user has access to for those particular layouts. In Provar, what we have the capability to do are two specific features, basically our extract layouts, which allows you to extract an entire page layout for a particular object, whether it be standard or custom. And then once you have that extraction, you can perform a validation at a later time. So that extraction will capture the entire permission set for that object, which would cover any read, write, modify permissions, visibility of elements, and things like that. So it's going to be able to compare it en masse using a data source. So it extracts it to like a CSV file, then we can compare it at a later time. So that's how we handle that specific use case. And all that happens, by the way, using API calls and things like that. So it happens very, very quickly. So you can do it for potentially, many, many layouts at a time. Okay. Okay, I see. Now, new to Provar, but we just got Provar Automation and wanted to confirm we can test Experience Cloud and communities without any add-ons. Yes. So everything is provided out of the box there. How do you store the record ID and use it in other test case for reference? Great question. There's multiple ways you can do that. So the way that I did it in my test, I used two different methods actually. I guess the simplest approach is to right-click on an element in your website and click Add to Test Case, and then in your interaction type in Provar, you want to set it to read assert, and then you can read the value basically, and that'll capture it as a variable. And then you can use that variable at another time in the test case, or you can pass it to another test case if there's like tests being chained in sequence. The other method is, of course, performing an API or a SQL query to retrieve that information from the backend. Hopefully that answers that question there. There's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to switch over to there and kind of cover these here. So, question here: how Provar validates the UI of the community portal, for example, if all images, content, and things are showing correctly for the user. I'm not entirely sure what you're looking for that one, but I will say, of course, we test it just like we test any other UI. You can validate attributes of elements, so you can check if elements are visible, if they're read-only, if they have certain value, things like that. But you can also test, entire workflows as I demonstrated, and you can extract different data from your elements and validate those. How does Provar validate the notification emails and its attachment sent to the Salesforce user? Yeah, great question. So we actually have a built-in connection type for Microsoft and Google connections, which allows you to set up a connection to your email server, and it all happens through the backend, actually. So rather than logging in to your particular website and logging in into your email inbox and then going, to the specific email, retrieving the information, etc. That's all very brittle if you were to do that in the UI using automation and Selenium or something like that. So we do it all through the back end. We can validate email, body, content, sender, etc. All through these connections that we have here. Question on data cleanup. Does Provar allow for hard delete of the data as part of the test data cleanup so the recycle bin is also cleared? I assume you mean the recycle bin inside of Salesforce. So when you delete a record using SQL, for the ones that aren't sent to the bin, you don't have to worry about that. For objects that are sent there, that is something that is done manually, to my knowledge. I don't believe there's unless someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but that's typically something you have to go in and actually manually perform. So it's not something we typically do through automation. Let's see. Going to the chat here. Can Provar do performance testing by simulating multiple users? Yes. So I did cover that. So we can log in as many users, run them in parallel, etc. We had a question about framing the test steps. So how do you frame test steps in Provar? Is it only the test cases you give as the functionality, or do we have any procedure? I'm not sure what you mean by framing the test steps. However, you have a way to create these logical groupings of your tests inside of Provar, which is what I've done here, basically using what we call a group step from the test palette. And I've grouped up my steps here, and I've given them specific names so I know what they're doing in this particular section. And you can rename any of your test steps to whatever you like. But I typically use group steps to kind of group my steps in my test case to be human readable. Usually tests are human readable by default, but this helps a little bit more for organization. Can we use OAuth usage login? If not, how can we run these in pipelines? Yes. So if you go into my admin connection here, you'll see I'm logged in as a normal user authentication using username and password, but we do have support for OAuth using web or JWT flow here. Good question. We have another question here on, so can you also use Provar to test Salesforce back office use case or just Experience Cloud? I'm sorry, you may have to rephrase your question. I don't know exactly what you're referring to there. I'm sorry. Okay. In a given test case, can test data setup cleanup vary by sandbox? For example, in a Dev Pro sandbox, we may not be able to create a lot of test data given the storage versus a full sandbox where more data can be created. Let me read that again. Sorry. So we may not be able to create a lot of test data given the storage versus, I see. Okay. Yeah. In general, my recommendation for automation and test data is that you create whatever record you need for the test to run as part of that test setup, and then you clean it up at the end. So ideally, tests should leave no footprint, right? That's kind of the idea. And they should be, for the most part, entirely what's the word I'm looking for? Solo, right? They don't need to rely, independent, I guess is the better word for it. They don't need to rely on any external data existing beforehand. I see this a lot of times with manual testing. People will go in to a specific record, and that's the record that they use for a particular scenario because it's already set up in the appropriate way. And that's easy. And I've done that myself quite a few times. So I know why people do it. But the problem with that method is that if you do a sandbox refresh and that record gets deleted, you're kind of just waiting for it to get created, or you have to go and create it yourself, and it's very labor intensive and it takes a lot of time staging all that data. So that's why with automation, we don't usually have that concern. We can create the data using SOQL, create whatever data we need as part of the test setup, and then we can delete it at the end. So that way, again, no footprint. Does Provar restrict only specific steps that are predefined in the tool already? No. I did cover this as part of my slides, but we have a way to create custom test steps. So you can create whatever functionality you want that we don't natively provide. I will say for the most use cases, you won't need that, but for pro code users, we have it available. Skimming through the chat here in the Q&A. There's quite a few. Appreciate all the questions, by the way. Great engagement. You all are awesome. How does Provar test record visibility? For example, an Experience Cloud user does not see more than what they are supposed to. I.e., if someone accidentally changes the OWD from private to public read-write and a user starts seeing more data than they should, nothing visibility changes on the Experience Cloud. Yeah, good question. So I kind of touched on this a little bit, but this is maybe a little bit more of a specific use case. But we can test for visibility of elements, and we can validate different attributes that are present in the HTML, such as read-only, inline editable, things like that. So all that is you can validate through Provar. It's built into the tool. So that's something that you would do for that particular use case. And of course, if you expect a certain step to pass or fail, then that's built into your test, and then you can adjust accordingly. Da da da. Just skimming through here. Sorry. Is it possible to verify font, color, or other UI details for a particular element on a website? Yeah, great question. The answer I'll give is it kind of depends on your specific scenario. If it's an image, we can capture image details and validate that. We actually have a way of doing that through AI as well. And if you're just wanting to verify like text or something like that, it may be a little bit different. It depends on what's available in the HTML, if those attributes are present, if there are certain tags that we can pull out. But yeah, I would have to know your specific scenario, what you're trying to do. My gut tells me, yes, it's possible, but we'd have to kind of look at it and see what we can do in that instance. We got questions about when is the new interface going to be available to customers? Soon. Not giving any dates yet. I will say we're going to be doing a demo at the end of February, so you can see it there again if you want to see more. Does Provar support Experience Cloud user notification assertions? Yes. If I understand your question, you're talking about the little bell icon. Can we validate those notifications? Yeah, we can do that. You basically just add a step to validate whatever you're trying to validate as part of that that workflow. But yeah, we can interact with those notifications and we can validate them. Okay, I think yeah, and chatter, email notifications. Yeah, so the email bit I covered as well. Still more questions coming in. Okay, how to validate element does not exist. So it's kind of like trying to prove something that doesn't exist. That's kind of difficult to do. The way that I typically would implement this type of scenario is I would first create a test case for the happy path, assuming the element does exist, mapping it there. And then if it doesn't exist in the future, that step will fail, right? So it's trying to interact with it or validate it, it's visible or something like that. So that's usually how I handle that scenario. You have to be able to map something in order to test it. So if it doesn't exist at all, then we can't really map it, right? So we'd have to map it first and then validate it afterwards. Okay, I think we're coming up on time. I know there's a couple questions there throughout about the new interface and such like that. We'll have more on the new interface, I promise. You'll be hearing more from us in the near future, and there's going to be, I believe, a follow-up as part of this. You'll get an invitation to that. Yeah, February 25th. There you go. There's the date. So if you want to know more about the new UI and some dates, we'll be able to share that in 12 days. And that'll be me again. So you can ask me some questions there. But thank you all so much for coming. Great questions, great engagement. I really enjoyed this. Hope you all enjoyed this presentation from Testing Experience Cloud in Provar. Have a nice day.